What if the person everyone called the villain was actually the one who was treated the worst all along? Because today we are diving into the shocking truth about Mary that the family never wanted viewers to question. And if you love deep drama breakdowns like this, hit subscribe right now because this channel exposes what other channels won't. Mary walks into every room outside her family and somehow becomes someone people trust, someone people admire, someone people want to be around. And yet, inside her own family, she becomes something entirely different. A shadow, a warning, a name whispered with tension. And that contradiction is where this story really begins. Because how does one woman become both loved and feared at the same time? How does someone build meaningful, thriving relationships in business and friendships, yet fail to connect with the very people she spent decades living with? And this is not just a simple personality clash. This is something deeper, something layered, something uncomfortable. Because when you start peeling it back, you realize this is not just about Mary. This is about the environment she lived in, the role she was forced into, and the silent rules that governed everything around her. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it because suddenly the narrative shifts and the person you thought you understood becomes a mystery again, and maybe even someone you start to sympathize with. And that is exactly where the tension builds, because for years, Mary has been labeled the difficult one, the cold one, the scary one. But what if that label was never the full truth? What if it was only one side of a much larger story? A story shaped by control, expectations, emotional neglect, and a system that rewarded silence and punished vulnerability. And this is where things start to get uncomfortable. Because if Mary was not the problem, then what was? And who benefited from that narrative staying exactly the way it was? Because the more you examine it, the more you notice patterns. Patterns in how conflict was handled, patterns in how blame was assigned, and patterns in how certain voices were amplified, while others were quietly dismissed. And Mary, from the very beginning, seems to have been placed into a role not entirely of her choosing. The enforcer, the disciplinarian, the one who carried out roles that were never fully hers. And when you think about that role, it becomes clear why she may have been perceived the way she was. Because discipline is rarely loved, especially when it comes from someone who is not seen as the emotional center of the family. And yet, the same behaviors, when exhibited by someone else, are often reframed differently, excused, even justified. And that raises a question that sits at the center of everything. Why was Mary held to a different standard? Why did her actions define her entire identity, while others were given room to be complex, to be flawed, to grow? And the answer might lie in something much deeper than individual behavior. It might lie in the structure of the family itself, because when you have a system that thrives on hierarchy and unspoken competition for emotional resources, it becomes almost inevitable that someone will be pushed into the role of the outsider, the scapegoat, the one who absorbs tension so the rest can function. And Mary seems to have been that person for a very long time. And what makes this even more compelling is that outside of that system, she thrives. She builds friendships, she maintains connections, she shows loyalty and support in ways that directly contradict the image painted within the family. And that contradiction cannot be ignored because it suggests that the issue was never her ability to connect, it was the conditions under which she was expected to connect. And those conditions were anything but stable. Because imagine trying to build genuine relationships in an environment where affection feels conditional, where validation comes and goes unpredictably, and where expressing pain is seen as disruption rather than something to be understood and healed. And over time, that kind of environment does something to a person. It shapes how they communicate, how they protect themselves, how they respond to conflict, and eventually it can make them appear exactly how they are being labeled, because survival often looks very different from the outside. And this is where the idea of the loop begins, because the more Mary was seen as difficult, the more she was treated as difficult. And the more she was treated that way, the more her behavior likely reflected the pressure of that perception, creating a cycle that reinforced itself over and over again. and breaking that cycle is not simple, especially when your identity has been tied to it for decades. Because for Mary, leaving or even redefining herself would not just mean changing relationships, it would mean unraveling an entire belief system, an entire way of understanding her place in the world. And that is not something people do easily or quickly. And so she stayed, she adapted, she endured. And in doing so, she became both a product of her environment and a symbol of its dysfunction. And the longer it went on, the harder it became to separate who she truly was from who she had been made to be. And this is what makes her story so compelling, because it forces you to question everything you thought you knew about her. And more importantly, it forces you to question the system that created that version of her in the first place. And just when you think you understand Mary, the story shifts again, because what we are seeing now is not the same woman who spent decades trying to survive within a system that never fully embraced her. What we are seeing now is someone who has found something she was missing for a very long time, and that is psychological safety. And that changes everything, because when a person finally feels safe enough to express themselves without fear of judgment or rejection, they begin to transform in ways that can seem almost unrecognizable to those who only knew them in survival mode. And this is where her friendships come into focus, because unlike the relationships within her family, these connections are built on consistency, on mutual respect, on genuine care. And that kind of foundation allows a person to rebuild their sense of self piece by piece. And what is most striking is how different Mary appears in these relationships. She is more open, more expressive, more willing to set boundaries, and that alone tells you something important, because it suggests that those qualities were always there. They were simply suppressed or discouraged in an environment that did not support them. And this is where the narrative begins to unravel, because if Mary is capable of healthy reciprocal relationships, then the idea that she is inherently difficult becomes much harder to defend. And instead, the focus shifts to the conditions that brought out the version of her that people struggled with. And this is where the concept of emotional neglect becomes impossible to ignore, because neglect is not always loud, it is not always obvious. Sometimes it is the absence of support, the absence of validation, the absence of someone simply showing up when it matters most. And over time, that absence can be just as damaging as any overt conflict, because it leaves a person feeling unseen, unheard, and ultimately disconnected. And for Mary, that disconnection seems to have been a constant theme, especially during moments when she needed support the most. And those moments leave a lasting impact, because they reinforce the belief that your needs are not important, that your pain is inconvenient. And that belief can shape how you interact with others in profound ways. And yet, despite all of that, Mary stayed for years, holding on to the possibility that things could change, that the relationships could improve, that the connection she longed for was still within reach. And that hope is both powerful and painful, because it keeps you invested even when the evidence suggests otherwise. And this is where the idea of a cycle becomes even more apparent, because every small moment of kindness, every brief instance of validation can feel like proof that things are getting better, even if those moments are inconsistent and short-lived. And that inconsistency creates a kind of emotional tension that is difficult to break free from, because it keeps you waiting, hoping, adjusting. And over time, it can make it incredibly difficult to walk away, even when you know something is not working. And this is what makes her eventual shift so significant, because it represents not just a change in circumstance, but a change in perspective. A realization that the kind of support she was seeking within her family was actually available to her elsewhere. And once she experienced that difference, once she felt what it was like to be valued consistently, it became much harder to accept anything less. And that is where the real turning point lies. Because when a person begins to recognize their own worth through the way others treat them, they start to question the relationships that made them feel otherwise. And that questioning can be the beginning of a completely new chapter, one where they are no longer defined by the roles they were assigned, but by the choices they make moving forward. And for Mary, that journey is still unfolding, and that is what keeps people watching, because there's a sense that we are witnessing something real, something messy, something deeply human. And at the center of it all is a question that does not have a simple answer. Was Mary ever truly the person she was made out to be? Or was she simply navigating a system that was never designed to let her fully thrive? And once you start asking that question, the entire story changes, and you find yourself looking at everything through a different lens, one that challenges assumptions, invites empathy, and leaves you wondering what other parts of this story have yet to be fully understood. So the real question is, was Mary ever the villain, or was she just the easiest one to blame? And once you start seeing it, you cannot unsee it. If you want more deep dives like this, hit subscribe right now, because the next story is even more shocking.